Good evening. I welcome you warmly on behalf of the Department of English and Comparative Literature at AUC to the 21st Memorial Lecture dedicated to Edward Said. It falls this year on his birthday, on the 1st of November, 1935. Said would have been 90 years old today if he were with us. Professor Edward Said was born in Jerusalem, Al-Quds, Palestine, and lived his youth in Egypt. He loved coming back to Egypt, where he was frequently invited as distinguished professor at AUC. When he passed away in 2003, my department decided to honor his memory by initiating the annual Edward Said Memorial Lecture series to be delivered by eminent intellectuals who intersect with Said's vision and the many disciplines he contributed to. The list, the 21 speakers, eminent scholars, is a long list, but I'm going just to give you the names. David Damrosch, Barbara Harlow, Cornel West, Terry Eagleton, Rukus de Groot, Judith Butler, John Carlos Rowe, Michael Wood, Sari Makdisi, Marina Warner, Leela Abulot, Sulaiman Dien, Usama Makdisi, Robert Young, Wadia Edward Said, Raja Shahadi, Noam Chomsky, Timothy Brennan, Professor Richard Falk, and Etienne Balibach. This year, South African professor of law, John Dugard, is delivering the Said Memorial Lecture. He will be introduced by my colleague from the law department at AUC, Hani Sayed.
Good evening. So this is the third time Ferial has asked me to introduce the speaker for the Edward Said Memorial Lecture. I'm truly grateful, Ferial, for the opportunity. I can honestly say that in my 20 years of service in the Department of Law at AUC, the honor of introducing Raja Shahade in 2022, Richard Falk in 2023, and John Dugard tonight stands out as one of the highest points of my academic life at this university. That this personal honor has come through encounters with some of the most inspiring figures in my discipline makes palpable to me how rare such moments of genuine intellectual exchange have become. Because of that, to me, and at a time when the very institution of the university in North America and elsewhere is facing some of its most defining challenges in the past 100 years, the American University in Cairo remains a unique institution with a historic role to play. Introducing Professor Dugard tonight confronts me as a legal academic with a preliminary question. It has to do with the fact that in recent years, a majority of those who have honored AUC by delivering the Edward Said Memorial Lecture have been lawyers, specifically international lawyers. There are, of course, layers of distance between the maze-like corridors of Al-Walid building, where Huss and the Department of Comparative Literature are housed, and the Department of Law located at the other end of campus. And it is this very distance that makes the question even more pressing. Why do we lawyers and literary critics keep meeting here under the name of Edward Said? One obvious answer, of course, is Palestine. Palestine as the paradigmatic question of global justice. Here, in the space of this lecture, the legacy of Edward Said becomes an embodiment of a cosmopolitan movement of political solidarity, one that transformed the cause of Palestinian self-determination into a hegemonic sign in the Gramscian sense of the word, capable of articulating diverse social struggles and giving them a shared direction without dissolving their differences. But as I prepared for each of these introductions, as I did for today through a panoramic reading of Professor Dugard's scholarship from the 1970s to the present, it became clear that beyond the biographical parallels and the friendships, there are deeper connections. Connections not immediately visible across disciplinary boundaries, yet perhaps more structurally determinative than biography in making meeting across disciplines both intellectually and politically imaginable. These connections relate to two foundational dimensions of our identities as academics: our relationship and positionality within our disciplines, and our relationship to politics. I have alluded to these links in past iterations of the Edward Said lecture, but they particularly are visible in the case of Professor Dugard. From this perspective, and through these connections, Dugard, Said, Falk, and Shahade become political friends in the most profound philosophical sense of the term, the kind of friendship that makes possible and indeed prefigures a political community of dignity and equality in a world where such communities seem impossible. The introduction to Edward Said's 1983 book, The World, the Text, and the Critic, provides me with the first vignette through which I want to convey to you the uniqueness of Professor Dugard's legal scholarship, through which I hope you can see that Edward Said to literary criticism is like John Dugard for international law. In that essay, Said presented the state of literary criticism in the late 70s as one in which literary critics started to read text as supernatural artifacts. They retreated into a labyrinth of textuality, committed to precious jargon and to an ethic of indifference to the world. They have given up a relationship to the world to be mesmerized by the aporias and the unthinkable paradoxes of a text. In opposition to these practices of literary criticism, Said described a form of praxis that he called secular criticism. In Said's words, and I quote, "Criticism can no longer cooperate in or pretend to ignore this enterprise, i.e., this practice of indifference to the world. It is not practicing criticism either to validate the status quo or to join up with a priestly caste of acolyte and dogmatic metaphysicians. The realities of power and authority, as well as the resistances offered by men, women, and social movements to institutions, authorities, and orthodoxies, are the realities that make texts possible, that deliver them to their readers, that solicit the attention of critics." Said proposed that these are the realities that should be taken account by criticism and the critical consciousness. At the time Edward Said published The World, the Text, and the Clinic, Professor Dugard was a law professor at the Faculty of Law in the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. He had already served as the dean of the faculty between 1975 and 1977. The late 70s and the 1980s were difficult years for liberal legal academics in South Africa as the apartheid regime took a sharp turn toward mass militarization and emergency rule. In that context, the relationship between law and politics and the role of judges and lawyers was anything but an academic question. These questions were inescapable for anyone in the legal field, whatever their position. It was in this climate that Professor Dugard wrote in 1987, and I quote, "The apartheid order is a legal order. Fashioned by politicians, it has been applied by lawyers. No South African lawyer has escaped the contamination of this order, which has infected judges, magistrates, prosecutors, advocates, attorneys, and academics. It is true that some lawyers have exploited the law in the furtherance of government policy, and that a smaller number has opposed these laws in word and deed, but the majority, probably without much thought, has acquiesced in the system in the belief that it is the function of lawyers to accept Parliament's will and to get on with the job of lawyering. This failure of the legal profession was by far Professor Dugard's most foundational intellectual and political concern throughout his career in and outside of South Africa. In his 1971 inaugural lesson at Witwatersrand University, which later became one of Professor Dugard's classic texts published in the South African Law Journal titled The Judicial Process, Positivism and Civil Liberty, he attributed this attitude of indifferent complicity among lawyers to their approach to law, to their way of thinking about law, and the way that was prevalent among South African lawyers. At the time, legal consciousness of elite lawyers and judges consisted with a brand of legal positivism that fetishized the distinction between lawmaking and law application. In that attitude, judges are neutral mouthpieces of the law, absolutely constrained by the will of Parliament. Their idealized vision of their legal work consistent in mechanical elaborations of abstract rules through syllogistic acrobatics. They were stuck in a heaven of legal concepts, otherworldly, and preoccupied with the endless reiteration of transcendental nonsense. Professor Dugard's secular criticism of legal consciousness of the time focused on bringing down the law from its heaven of legal concepts to engage with the world, to engage with, and I quote again Said, the realities of power and authority, as well as the resistances offered by men, women, and social movements to institutions, authorities, and orthodoxies. But Professor Dugard went even further. In his approach, he modeled a very familiar legal realist move in which, to quote from a classic legal realist text from the 1930s, the mere collection of social facts without a selective criterion of human values produces horrid wilderness of useless statistics. Legal criticism is empty without objective description of the causes and consequences of legal decision. Legal description is blind without the guiding light of a theory of values. It is through the union of legal science and critical theory of values that our understanding of the human significance of law will be enriched. Now, this brings me to the second vignette I would like to share, one that captured the uniqueness of Professor Dugard's perspective on law and legal practice. And it speaks to his ethic of responsibility, an ethic that demands the courage of decision in the face of political contingency. In the mid-1980s, liberal lawyers opposed to the apartheid regime were grappling with the difficult question of political tactics and moral responsibility. The role of lawyers and judges in enforcing fundamentally unjust laws had become a pressing issue. Within these debates, many argued that if judges were to reconcile their conscience with their calling, they had no choice but to resign. Participation in the daily routines of legal practice under apartheid, they insisted, served only to legitimate what was, in essence, a crime against humanity. Professor Dugard's response to this dilemma was very distinctive. He was fully aware of the nefarious nature of apartheid regime. Indeed, during the same period, his scholarship in public international law was pioneering in defining apartheid as a crime against humanity. His work, it was later informed the incorporation of crime against humanity, of apartheid as a crime against humanity in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Yet for him, resignation was not the moral cause of action. Instead, resignation, Professor Dugard argued with great eloquence and moral clarity that the ethical role of lawyers and judges was to confront their own responsibility in the production and reproduction of apartheid law. Withdrawal, he wrote, can more accurately be described as a dereliction of duty than as a sign of moral strength. Lawyers, he insisted, could and must engage politically in the struggle against apartheid as lawyers and judges, rather than ceding the legal battlefield to the regime apologists. And interestingly, in making this argument, Professor Dugard drew inspiration from the work of Palestinian lawyers in the West Bank, particularly that of Rajash Hadi, another speaker in Edward Said Memorial Lecture Series, whom I had the honor of introducing in 2023. Under these conditions, Professor Dugard's decisions to remain engaged in the struggle as a lawyer is difficult to characterize. It will feel familiar to many lawyers in Egypt who have also had to defend human dignity under emergency rule. For those of you who are familiar with the history of the human rights movement in this country, his courage, Professor Dugard's courage in embracing the role of lawyer within an unjust order recalls the war of the late Ahmed Seif. John Dugard to South Africa is like Ahmed Seif to Egypt. Their position cannot be explained by reason alone. When the risks are great and the possibility of change through law seems impossible. And yet, it is not madness. To insist on your responsibility for political change as a lawyer under such conditions is more than a professional choice. It's more than a political choice. It is, in the radical existential sense of the word, a leap of faith. Kierkegaard reminds us, faith is no aesthetic emotion, but something far higher. It is not the spontaneous inclination of the heart, but it's the paradox of existence. It is this leap of faith that can best describe Professor Dugard's trajectory as a legal academic and international lawyer in and outside of South Africa. Thank you, Professor Dugard, for your unwavering commitment to the right side of history. It is an honor to meet you, and it's a privilege to introduce you to the American University in Cairo. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those kind words of welcome. I must confess that I don't often find a speaker today recalling my days in South Africa. Today one concentrates more on Palestine, and so it was a very special privilege, really, to have my early days as a South African lawyer recalled. But of course, there are major parallels between apartheid South Africa and Palestine. I'm not going to focus much on them this evening, although I will, on occasion, digress and make a few comments about South Africa, but today, inevitably, as we will be focusing on the work of Edward Said, the emphasis will be on Palestine. But thank you very much for those kind words of welcome. Of course, I should begin by saying it's a very special day for Egypt, the day that we have been waiting for many years, the opening of GEM, the Grand Egyptian Museum. It's also a very special day for another reason. Professor Ghazoul has reminded us of that. It is Edward Said's 90th birthday today. And so today is a very special day for many reasons. And for me, it is a great honor and privilege to be able to deliver the Edward Said Memorial Lecture this evening. In some respects, this may be seen as a type of birthday present, a 90th birthday present for Edward Said. I never met Edward, although I was deeply involved in the Palestine-Israel conflict in what Edward Said called the question of Palestine in the last years of his life. But I unfortunately never met him. I somehow believed that our paths would inevitably cross, but they never did, and I did not go out of my way to make sure that they did. So, unfortunately, I never met Edward Said. I wish to thank the American University of Cairo for the invitation to deliver this lecture this evening. It's a great pleasure for me and for my wife, Etche, to be in Cairo today. This is not my first visit, but it is Etche's first visit. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to welcome her to Cairo in the same way that I introduced her to Palestine many years ago when I was Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory. As a result of that visit, Etche became a fierce critic of Israel's injustices towards Palestinians. And of course, I wish to extend a special word of thanks to Professor Ferial Ghazoul for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I know that Edward Said played a very special role in her life, and I greatly appreciate the fact that she has entrusted me with the honor of paying tribute to him today. Edward Said was a great scholar, a prolific writer. I claim no expertise in either literary criticism or comparative literature, the subjects for which Edward is best known. I have read many of the books that are analyzed by him in his masterpiece Orientalism, in Culture and Imperialism, and in his Wreath Lectures of 1993, and in many other works. I must confess that his critical analysis of these books has made me acutely aware of my own ignorance, of what I missed in reading the very same books. So I regret that I can make no contribution in this field, the intellectual area for which Edward Said is best remembered. Of course, Edward Said is also remembered for his outspoken views on what he termed the question of Palestine. And it is the application of what he termed Orientalism to the question of Palestine that I intend to speak about today. In so doing, I shall follow Edward's advice of appealing to the past as a strategy for interpreting the present. Edward Said's masterpiece, Orientalism, is not a dull exercise in scholarship. True, it is a scholarly work that describes the paternalistic way in which scholars from the West have written about the Arab world. Its intellectual challenges and its wide-ranging criticisms explains why it was critically debated and acclaimed by scholars throughout the world. Orientalism was not, however, a study for literary scholars alone. His portrayal of the way in which politicians and colonial administrators viewed the Arab world, the Orient, provided disturbing insights into the way in which the West viewed the Orient, what we would today call the global South. Said saw what he called Orientalism not only as a paternalistic perception of the West. More important, he saw it as a justification for subjugation, as fundamentally a political doctrine willed over the Orient because the Orient was weaker than the West. Said wrote that since the Oriental was a member of a subject race, he had to be subjected. It was that simple. For him, imperialism and colonialism were the instruments employed by the West to achieve this subjugation. Said reminds us that by 1918, the European powers were in colonial occupation of about 85% of the globe. of which a large segment belonged to regions formerly known simply as Oriental. With great perspicacity, he saw that the West's perception of the Orientalism is to Arabs what anti-Semitism is to Jews. Said was particularly concerned about the West's imposition or infliction of its colony Israel on the Arab world. He saw clearly that while the colonization of Palestine was in line with European colonialism, Zionism made it different, very different. With its ideology of God's chosen people returning to their ancestral home, to establish a Jewish state in a land without a people, this was to be a virulent form of colonialism. For Zionists, the fact that there was already a people living in Palestine, a people who had been there for centuries, was a problem to be overcome by dispossession, displacement, and dehumanization. Said shows how early Zionist leaders portrayed the Zionist ambition as that of a European-style colonial enterprise, and concealed that it was in fact a national liberation movement. A national liberation movement in much the same way that Hamas is a national liberation movement. Zionism was a movement determined to establish a Jewish state in Palestine to the detriment and ultimate displacement of the indigenous population. Said saw this very clearly. In furtherance of this portrayal of Zionism as a colonizing movement, and in order to gain the support of the West, Zionist leaders invoked the racial superiority of Jews over Palestinians. Zionists wisely believed that this essential component of colonialism would be well understood by the Western colonizers and appreciated. So they argued that Zionists and Europeans shared, in the words of Said, in common the ideals of fair play, civilization, and progress, none of which the Oriental could understand. In other words, Palestinians were the Untermenschen. Apartheid in South Africa was also a colonial enterprise, not very different. White South Africans saw themselves as Europeans, engaged in a European enterprise of progress and civilization in Southern Africa. The indigenous black population was undoubtedly inferior. Like the Jews, Afrikaners in South Africa portrayed themselves as God's chosen people, appointed to do God's will in Southern Africa. Let me digress for a moment on South Africa and make a comment on South Africa and Palestine. I experienced racism in South Africa as director of an anti-apartheid litigation and advocacy center, and I experienced racism in occupied Palestine as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Palestine. Unlike subsequent special rapporteurs, I was allowed to visit Palestine and to travel freely in the territory. And I did so for many years, for 7 years in fact. And so this gave me an opportunity to witness at first hand Israel's apartheid in practice. Now, based on these experiences of South Africa and of Palestine, I can say categorically that in South Africa, apartheid was not as vicious or as brutal as it is in Palestine, as carried out by Israel in Palestine. Nor was racial discrimination as severe in South Africa as it is in respect of Palestinians in occupied Palestine. This was a judgment that I made well before the 7th of October 2023, and you will not be surprised when I say that it was a judgment that angered Israel most during my time as Special Rapporteur. But let me return to Said's views on Zionism. Said saw clearly that Zionists employed the alleged victimization of Jews and anti-Semitism as weapons to silence critics. A Jewish homeland in Palestine was portrayed as a solution to the victimization of Jews by anti-Semites in the West. Inevitably, it was argued that opponents of the Jewish homeland in Palestine were anti-Semitic. Already in its early days, anti-Semitism was used by Zionists to achieve their goals as an effective weapon to counter criticism of Zionism. Edward Said maintained a critical eye on events in the Middle East until his death in 2003. The evils of the occupation and the denial of Palestinian self-determination featured prominently in his writings. That the Oslo Accords were a sellout was immediately apparent to him. Thank you. He described the Accords as flawed, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles, long before the faults of the Oslo Accords became glaringly apparent. Said was horrified by the expansion of settlements and the failure of Oslo to challenge their existence, and he was one of the first Palestinians to argue that Israel applied apartheid in the Palestinian territory. This was a conclusion that was confirmed by the International Court of Justice in its advisory opinion of July 2024. But for many years, people resisted accepting the idea that Israel was applying apartheid, particularly in the West. It has become very unacceptable to argue that Israel is in fact an apartheid state. But Said saw this a long time ago. Said wrote at length about Zionism. He was fully aware of the fact that the ultimate Zionist goal was the displacement of Palestinians, their removal from Palestine, so that it would become a place where the Jews, enjoying a unique historical privilege, could reconstitute the land into a Jewish homeland. Said was acutely aware of the manner in which Palestinians had been forced to flee Palestine in the Nakba. He saw this process of ethnic cleansing as in line with the aims of Zionism to dispossess and to expel the Palestinian population from their ancestral home. Said failed, however, to distinguish between the different strands of Zionism which were used to dispossess Palestinians of their land. Had he examined the revisionist and messianic approaches to Zionism, he would have been even more despondent than he was. Revisionist Zionism, advocated by Jabotinsky and Benjamin Netanyahu's father, and by Benjamin Netanyahu himself, contemplates the removal of Palestinians from their homeland by all means, and the denial of a Palestinian state. Messianic Zionism, inspired by the book of Joshua's brutal genocides, on the other hand, envisages both the expulsion of Palestinians from their homeland and their extermination. Many of you will remember the African-American spiritual, Joshua fought the Battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. As a child in South Africa, I used to interpret this as a victory for the brave Israelites over the wicked Canaanites. But this spiritual says nothing about what happened to the Canaanites. In order to find out what happened to them, one has to read chapter 7 of the book of Joshua. And there one finds that Jericho was utterly destroyed, and that all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, were killed with the edge of the sword. So this story, like many other stories of Israelite victories in the Bible, is a genocide foretold. It's small wonder that people like Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's current Minister of Finance, and his national religious party, religious Zionists, believe that the problem of Palestine is to be solved in the same way that it was solved at Jericho many, many centuries ago. Failure to have regard to these fanatical versions of Zionism led Said and most critics, including myself, to fail to predict that the solution of the Palestinian problem was not only ethnic cleansing as far as Zionism was concerned, but it was ethnic cleansing to be accompanied by genocide. So now let me turn to the Nakba, ethnic cleansing, and genocide. The Nakba was clearly an exercise in ethnic cleansing, but at the same time it was undoubtedly a genocide. It included killings, the infliction of serious bodily and mental harm, and the imposition of conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the Palestinian people. And it was intended to destroy in whole or in part the Palestinian people. So it met the requirements of the crime of genocide under the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Yet it was, and still is, described as an exercise in ethnic cleansing. Writers such as Rashid Khalidi and Ilan Pape describe the Nakba as ethnic cleansing and not as genocide. This despite the fact that the evidence they rely on more accurately supports genocide. Pape, under the influence of the ethnic cleansing of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s, states in his book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that the expulsion of a people that constitutes ethnic cleansing, accompanied by massacres, is not part of a genocidal plan. Massacres, he says, are merely a key tactic employed to accelerate the flight of the population earmarked for expulsion. What occurred in Palestine in 1948, he concludes, forms a clear-cut case of ethnic cleansing. Why this insistence that the Nakba consisted of ethnic cleansing only and was not a genocidal war? There are several reasons, I believe, for this refusal to address genocide in the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict. First, the Genocide Convention was approved by the UN General Assembly on 9 December 1948 and only came into force in January 1951. This means that it was not part of the language of the law. at the time when the Nakba started in November 1947. Second, the Genocide Convention emphasizes the need to prove an intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group in order to commit the crime of genocide. Both the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court have interpreted this to mean that it is necessary to prove that a state charged with genocide intends to carry out the physical destruction of the group and not its mere displacement. This is what is known as the special intent required for the crime of genocide, in its Latin form, dolus specialis. This was clearly stated by the International Court of Justice in its decisions involving both Bosnia-Herzegovina and Croatia in the 1990s. But there is another explanation for this failure to consider the Nakba as genocide. And this is probably more important. There is a widespread belief fostered by Zionist Hasbara that genocide is a term that should be used only to describe the Holocaust of Jews. This is demonstrated by the Israeli law that makes war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide crimes under Israeli law. It describes them not as crimes against the international community, against humanity, as genocide is generally seen, but as crimes against the Jewish people. Genocide, in other words, can only be committed against the Jewish people. Significantly, the architect of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, the Jewish Pole, Raphael Lemkin, did not suggest that the crime of genocide should be limited to Jews. Although his own family had been largely destroyed in the Holocaust, he took the view that genocide was a crime against humanity itself and not against a particular group only. That Zionists see genocide as a crime committed against Jews and not a crime committed by Jews explains why the genocide case of South Africa versus Israel before the International Court of Justice has invoked and led to so much criticism and division. I'm sure you've all experienced the division that this case has brought about in families, between friends, and in society at large. Let me stress that South Africa brought the case against Israel in the words of the preamble of the Genocide Convention, because international cooperation is required to liberate mankind from such an odious scourge as genocide. At a time when humanity required some state to step forward and take the lead in stopping Israel's genocide, South Africa took that step. South Africa, that itself had experienced the scourge of apartheid, was not prepared to allow Palestine to suffer. You must recall that on his release from prison in 1990, one of Mandela's first comments was, "South Africa will not be free until Palestine is free." And that is a philosophy that has guided the South African government ever since. Immediately after South Africa brought the case against Israel, it was accused of committing a blood libel against the Jewish people and obviously of an anti-Semitic act. In addition, it was accused of abusing the term genocide. South Africa was accused by Israel of abusing the crime of genocide by arguing that the Genocide Convention, which was designed to protect the Jewish people alone from genocide, was being invoked by South Africa against the Jewish state of Israel. So reasons of this kind have really prevented states and people from seeing Israel as a state capable of committing the crime of genocide. And of course, it has made it very obvious to us that we should be very careful about using this term in respect of Israel. No one likes to be accused of being anti-Semitic. It brings with it serious consequences, and so we prefer not to accuse Israel of genocide. Before the present genocidal attack on Gaza after the 7th of October 2023, the word genocide was only used once to describe Israel's actions. That was in 1982 when the General Assembly of the United Nations described Israel's attacks on the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila as a massacre that was an act of genocide. At the same time, a commission of inquiry chaired by the Nobel Peace Laureate Sean McBride found that Israel was responsible for the massacre of Sabra and Shatila and recommended that a body be established to clarify the conception of genocide in relation to the policies and practices of Israel towards the Palestinian people. Subsequent actions of Israel in Gaza, particularly Operation Cast Lead 2008 to 2009 and Operation Protective Edge of 2013, undoubtedly had genocidal features. United Nations commissions of inquiry were established to consider these operations. They investigated the operations carefully, but they preferred to characterize Israel's actions as constituting war crimes. There was no consideration of the crime of genocide. I was involved in the work of two bodies charged with the investigation of these two operations. First, the fact-finding committee established by the League of Arab States, in which I chaired a commission of 6 jurists from different countries which investigated Operation Cast Lead. Second, there was the Russell Tribunal, what might be described as a people's court, initially set up by the philosopher Bertrand Russell to investigate crimes committed by the United States in the Vietnam conflict. This court or panel, comprising lawyers and prominent public figures, considered Operation Protective Edge, and in so doing it followed the procedures of a criminal trial. Both these bodies addressed the question of whether Israel's actions might be characterized as genocide, but both resisted pressure to make a full finding of genocide, largely because such a finding would damage the credibility of the reports. Both did at least make findings that Israel's actions were to be assessed, to be considered in the context of the crime of genocide, however. The Russell Tribunal warned that it was compelled to place the international community on notice as to the risk of genocide being perpetrated. Then there was the Arab League Fact-Finding Committee. This brings back very painful memories for me, and I'm very pleased that one of the members of the Commission is with us this evening. The committee visited Gaza in early 2009, shortly after Israel had withdrawn its forces. I have vivid memories of destruction that reminded me of films of the destruction of Dresden and Berlin in World War II, of hospitals, schools, mosques, and homes that had been bombed, and perhaps particularly of interviews with persons who told stories of random and arbitrary killings by IDF soldiers. At the end of our 10 days investigation, I met with a team of 6 lawyers to discuss what crimes we should identify in our report. To my surprise, to my horror, the unanimous opinion was genocide. This placed me as chair in a real quandary. I shared the view that what we had viewed was a genocide, but I knew that the credibility of our report would suffer if we were to accuse Israel of genocide. So I persuaded the committee to use other terms to describe Israel's actions. So we described Israel's actions as war crimes, crimes against humanity, and collective punishment. I was wrong. Today I deeply regret this decision. Had our committee condemned Israel for genocide, it would have prepared the international community to accept that Israel was capable of genocide, and that the international community should be on guard to prevent this from happening. The failure of states, statespersons, and particularly lawyers to consider Israel's actions before 2023 in the context of the crime of genocide has had important consequences. Without full warning of Israel's genocidal intentions and capabilities, states were simply unprepared to consider Israel as a genocidal state when in 2023 it embarked upon a campaign of genocide as a punishment for Hamas's actions on the 7th of October 2023. This unwillingness of states to accept that Israel is guilty of genocide is, I believe, in part due to the absence of a warning that Israel had the intention to commit genocide, that the messianic and possibly the revisionist versions of Zionism predicted such an action. Let me now turn to Israel's genocidal war against Gaza. Before I do so, I wish to make a personal comment on this subject. As one of South Africa's counsel in this genocide case against Israel, I have obviously a special interest in what Israel has done in Gaza and what is doing. But for me and for my wife, it is a very personal matter. We know Gaza so well, or we knew Gaza as it then was so very well. When I was UN Special Rapporteur, we visited Gaza twice a year. We visited every corner of Gaza. We met its people. We enjoyed its hospitality and witnessed its beauty. Although Gaza was an open prison and occupied territory, one could not resist the charm of Gaza. Gaza is more than a wonderful, quote, piece of real estate, in the words of President Trump. It is a warm home to over 2 million people in a beautiful setting. To see on TV screens the destruction that Israel has wrought upon Gaza and its people is painful, very painful. I believe that the restoration of Gaza to its former glory and beauty is a challenge that will face the world, a challenge to all of us, but it will be a difficult task. Let me now turn to genocide in Gaza. Today, the evidence that Israel has committed genocide in its onslaught in Gaza is overwhelming. It has been investigated, examined, and judged, and found to be guilty of genocide by the United Nations Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the occupied Palestinian territory. It has been found to be guilty of genocide by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the occupied Palestinian territory, Francesca Albanese. It has been found to be guilty of genocide by the International Association of Genocidal Scholars. And it has been found to be guilty of genocide by many NGOs, including Amnesty International and the Israeli NGO B'Tselem. And of course, in addition, many states, lawyers, scholars, public officials, and millions of people throughout the world in many countries have come to the conclusion on an examination of the facts that Israel is guilty of genocide. Although the International Court of Justice has yet to make a final decision on this subject, it has ruled that the right of Palestinians to be protected from acts of genocide is, quote, plausible, unquote. It has found that Israel is obliged to take all measures to prevent the commission of acts of genocide in the Gaza Strip. Turning to the Genocide Convention and to its requirements and to the factual situation in Gaza, one might start by commenting that in most cases in which genocide is alleged, the evidence of the facts constituting the crime of genocide are clear. It's very easy to prove killing, causing mental and bodily harm, and the creation of conditions calculated to bring about the destruction of a particular group. But it is more difficult to prove the required specific intent, the dolus specialis for the crime. This is the difficult requirement of the Genocide Convention. But in this respect, Israel's genocide of Gaza is perhaps unique because prominent Israeli figures have not hesitated to provide the evidence of genocidal intent. The Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs, the President, politicians, generals, and ordinary scholars have all made statements of vengeance, destruction, and annihilation quite openly. They've been warned by some of the more sane authorities in Israel to desist from such statements because it will lead to the proof of the genocidal intent. But this has not stopped them from making statements of this kind. So Gazans have been called human animals that must be exterminated, Nazis, terrorists. Statements of this kind provide clear evidence of the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, and at the same time of genocidal intent. Israel has labeled the entire population, including women and children, babies almost, as being terrorists. President Herzog, alleged to be a moderate, declared it is an entire nation out there in Gaza that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians who are not aware and not involved. It is absolutely not true. Biblical rhetoric has been employed to compare the fate of the people of Gaza to those tribes mentioned in the Bible who were wiped out for challenging the Jews. Prime Minister Netanyahu often reminds Israelis of the fate of the Amalekites, who, according to the Bible, were condemned by God to total annihilation for attacking the Jews. This call to remember the Amalekites, has been repeated by other cabinet ministers, including Bezalel Smotrich, who called for the total annihilation of the people of Gaza. The people of Gaza are often described as animals, human animals. The former Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, declared that Israel was fighting human animals and that everything in Gaza should be eliminated. David Levi, commander of the Givati Brigade, called for the total extermination of Gaza and all two-legged animals there. There is not one innocent person in Gaza. They have one option only: annihilation. These are simply a sample of the genocidal statements that are to be found, and there are many more. So Israel's specific intent to commit genocide, to destroy a group of people in whole or in part, is clear from statements of this kind, expressing an intent to destroy the Palestinian population of Gaza. In addition, such an intent may be inferred from the high number of deaths, the maiming, the starvation, and massive destruction of homes, hospitals, and Palestinian institutions. These actions make Israel's intention to destroy the Palestinian group in Gaza very clear. In addition, a specific intent to destroy the Palestinian group of Gaza is clear from the dehumanization of the Palestinian people. B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights NGO, in a study appropriately termed Our Genocide, examines the way in which the Zionist Israeli narrative has dehumanized Palestinians. B'Tselem is correct when it states dehumanization and demonization are a necessary enabling condition for the perpetration of genocide. Israel's genocidal war has resulted in the killing of over 68,000 Palestinians, the maiming of many more, the greatest number of child amputations in any conflict in modern times, famine, and the destruction of over 80% of Gaza's homes. Hospitals have been deliberately destroyed, doctors and journalists assassinated. Gaza's cultural life, its identity, its future have been destroyed with the destruction of mosques, churches, museums, schools, universities. Gaza's genocide bears comparison with the Holocaust of Jews, with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and other tragedies of this kind. Today, it is often said that one should not compare any genocide to the Holocaust, but there is no doubt, in my mind at least, that comparisons of this kind are apt. Of course, Israel's responsibility will be judged by the International Court of Justice. Unfortunately, this will take time. Justice moves slowly at the International Court of Justice. The procedures of the court are cumbersome, not designed to deal with an ongoing genocide. So it is unlikely that a decision can be expected before 2027. But the complicity of other states, particularly the West, for failing to halt Israel's genocide must also be examined. And these states will be judged not by the International Court of Justice, but by history. Allow me to make some comments on this subject. After World War II, in response to the Holocaust, and to ensure that it never happened again, governments of the West created a legal order premised on respect for human rights and accountability for the commission of international crimes. How is it that these same governments have now failed to take action to halt Israel's genocide? And worse still, have supported Israel with their silence, their friendship, and of course, the sale of arms. How is it that nations proud of their achievements in fashioning a world order based on the rule of law to prevent another Holocaust have deliberately refused to accept the decision of the International Court of Justice in its case of South Africa versus Israel? This decision puts states on notice of their obligations under the Genocide Convention. And states have simply refused to heed this warning. While one asks, have most Western states refused to use the G word, genocide, in respect of Israel's actions, despite all the evidence of genocide? How does one explain the manner in which Western states have simply ignored the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice rendered soon after the court's decision in the genocide case against Israel? In July 2024, the court issued an advisory opinion which held that Israel's continued occupation of Palestine is unlawful and must be brought to an end rapidly. It held that Israel is in law obliged to end its occupation as rapidly as possible and to cease all settlement activity. Later, the General Assembly of the United Nations gave Israel until the 18th of September 2025 to bring the occupation to an end. That day went almost completely unnoticed. Obviously, the occupation has not been brought to an end, and few states have indicated that in their judgment it should be brought to an end. In this advisory opinion, the court also held that the Palestinian people have a right of self-determination, and this right includes the right to an independent Palestinian state, which the International Court of Justice considers will contribute to regional stability and to security for all states in the Middle East. Today, 159 states have recognized Palestine as an independent state, but very few Western states have done this. Why? Let me digress again on the South African experience. During the apartheid years, the international community, United Nations, led by Western states, imposed severe sanctions on South Africa for applying the policy of apartheid and for attacking neighboring states. Financial, economic, cultural, and sporting sanctions were imposed. South Africa lost its credentials in the General Assembly of the United Nations. And in 1978, a mandatory arms embargo was imposed on South Africa. The international community respected advisory opinions that the International Court of Justice had given on apartheid in Namibia. Apartheid was undoubtedly evil, but it was never suggested at all, that apartheid constituted the crime of genocide. So one asks, why this double standard? Why was the West prepared to stand up against South Africa and impose sanctions against South Africa, but lacks the courage to take action against Israel? Of course, there are many reasons that one could advance. The fear of being labeled as anti-Semitic, Holocaust guilt in the case of some countries, and today the fear of offending President Trump. The refusal of states, particularly of the West, to seriously consider decisions of the primary institutions of international law, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and the United Nations, and to respect the most basic principles of international law, has serious consequences for the international legal order. It shows that many states of the West today follow what one might describe as the Trumpian notion of the law of deals, of a world order premised on deals, not on international law. One has yet to hear President Trump or Marco Rubio or any member of the Trump administration mention the word international law. I've been listening very closely for the use of the word international law since the administration came into office, but I haven't yet to hear this word. Western leaders have mirrored Trump's example in their dealings with Israel, and they've refused to judge Israel in terms of international law. They've simply exempted Israel from international law. Very, very different from the attitude towards Russia's attack on Ukraine, which rightly is judged in terms of international law. This augurs ill for the future of international law and world peace. Let me end by turning once again to Edward Said and to ask the question whether his writings on Orientalism provide some explanation for this sad state of affairs. Is it a coincidence that most of the states of the West that have failed Palestine are former colonial powers? States with memories of relations between the colonial power and the subjugated people, of massacres they themselves have committed against colonial subjects. Is Germany's denial of Israel's genocide intended to replicate the long denial of its genocide of the Herero and Nama people of Southwest Africa? Do Western states see Israel's genocide as the punishment of a barbaric colonial people that has violently rebelled against its civilizing colonial ruler? I do not know. Is it a coincidence that the state responsible for the Balfour Declaration and the creation of the State of Israel, the United Kingdom, persists in refusing to accept that Israel has committed genocide against the Palestinian people of Gaza? Do the United Kingdom and other Western states still accept the Zionist myth that prompted the Balfour Declaration, that Jews and Europeans share in common the ideals of fair play, civilization, and progress, none of which the Oriental can understand. Orientalism is not the cause of Israel's genocide, but the question one has to ask is whether it has contributed to the West's response. Has it made it easier for the West to do little or to do nothing, to stop Israel's assault on Gaza and its people? That is a question which I think we must all face and consider. Let me end tonight with the words of Edward Said, delivered shortly before his death in a speech at this university, the American University of Cairo. Words which are probably more valid today than they were in 2003. Said said, "There are many oppressed people in the world today. I'm not saying that the Palestinians are the most oppressed, but I am saying that they are the most visible. They lay a special claim to universal attention. They represent on the world stage a wrong that must be righted." Thank you.
Entertain some questions, Professor Dugard?
I'll hold it.
Yes. But we need questions.
Yes, okay. Please go ahead.
Professor Dugard, thank you very much for your inspiring words and for, well, the testimony of the actions and the words that you and the positions you've taken throughout your career, which I think have inspired all of us. It's the sort of the binary fault, not the dialogue is between sort of the position of the West and that of Israel, which I think we all understand. And I'm making the connection back to the inspiring words that you gave in the introduction, which was an appeal and a prerogative of the legal profession to stand up in times when a deterministic legal code is sort of removed from its values. And we're seeing that happening at the moment. My question to you is, if you are in the legal profession of the sort of aggressor, you're working as a lawyer in Israel, or you're a member of civil society of politics there, and you see this happening in your own country. This is also a dilemma, which has happened it happened to white people in Germany and in other countries, and in your country as well. Have you experienced moments of courage or people standing up in Israel to say what our country, the narrative of our country and of our leaders and of our legal leaders is leading this interpretation of law and system astray? And are they even able to stand up and have a voice, or are they risking their lives?
Well, essentially, you raised the question of the responsibility of the legal profession, and I suppose one should begin by asking, why single out the legal profession for particular condemnation? I think the answer to that question is clear, that lawyers have a responsibility because they know or should know what the law is, and they know that the law is being violated. So I think that lawyers do have a special responsibility. I don't think one could say that lawyers as a whole have exercised that responsibility. Obviously, individuals have. But we must remember that the vast majority of lawyers are not human rights activists, and so one can expect them to get on with the job of assisting corporations and clients with their particular personal problems, and not with big issues such as whether Israel is committing the crime of genocide. But I think one must bear in mind the fact that the accusation of anti-Semitism is a very serious weapon, and it is employed against lawyers. So individual lawyers who stand up and criticize Israel are immediately accused of being anti-Semitic, and that is not very good for one standing in the profession or for attracting more clients. And so one finds that lawyers prefer to remain silent, as I think is the case with most people in society, that the weapon of anti-Semitism does silence critics, and lawyers are no exception.
All right, thank you. Thank you for the microphone. It was a wonderful tie-in at the end with Orientalism and how the West is reluctant to place sanctions. And I was thinking back to the previous ties we've connected with South Africa and Israel, and how you mentioned the boycotting of South Africa as a very effective tool in ending apartheid. And the UN passed a resolution calling for the boycotting of South Africa, and I believe 1962. And it's only really in like the mid-'80s when grassroots organizations and campaigns really started applying pressure to end, or for governments to boycott South Africa. And I believe that it was just last year that the UN passed the same resolution for Israel. So I was wondering how can kind of the public apply pressure to our governments to pass such boycotting measures in a more rapid sense and against anti-BDS laws that you might find in several different nations. I'm in America, Virginia, and our protests at my campus were quelled because of anti-BDS laws. So how do you think we can kind of get around these barriers?
Well, you raise a number of big questions. I suppose on one hand you are asking whether we the people can influence the United Nations and compel the United Nations to impose sanctions of some kind on Israel. And that brings one to the present state of the United Nations. And I think that the war in Gaza has emphasized the shortcomings of the United Nations, the weaknesses of the United Nations. You have a situation in which one power with a veto power has in effect prevented the United Nations from taking action. The United Nations has been willing to take action. The Secretary General has taken a very strong stand on the subject, and the Security Council has adopted resolutions but which have been vetoed by the United States. So the answer to the question, how does one compel the United Nations to take action, is that it all depends on how one persuades the United States to do so. But you also really raise the question of what individuals can do, and that comes back to the role of civil society. In the case of apartheid in South Africa, it's no secret that civil society was particularly active and ultimately compelled governments to take firm action against South Africa. So initially, governments in the West, United Kingdom, France, United States were relatively sympathetic towards the South African government. But civil society in those states compelled the government to change its position, so that even the United States ultimately adopted a strong stand against apartheid in South Africa. So civil society does have an important role to play in persuading governments to take a firmer action.
Sabri.
Hello. Thank you very much for such a wonderful lecture, and for the link between the beginning of Orientalism as a whole project. And Orientalism for me is a whole project of discourse that starting to identify how relations of power are built into the discourse and how discourse perpetuates such relations of power. And he continued, Edward Said, to emphasize this and to develop it through a number of important works, from culture and imperialism until more or less the end of his career and his work on Palestine and so on. Therefore, the very important things that Said taught us is that without a change in the discourse of that relations of power, change doesn't take place in reality. And your lecture with the link of the two shows us how very difficult to actually change the discourse that created this settler Zionist project in the Middle East, and how changing that discourse is a very important step towards a change in reality. And my question is, do you see that the change gathering momentum that would lead to a change on the ground? Thank you.
I didn't quite get that question. I'm not sure. What do you mean by change in discourse?
The discourse that dominated the West, that actually Israel has the right to exist, has the right to defend itself, has the right to do everything that we here in the Middle East have been aware of, the fact that she has none of these rights. None of the right to oppress the Palestinians, to occupy their land, to take over their territory, etc. This discourse now, for the first time, is changing in the West, not only here. Here we always understood and we always had a discourse that is aware of so many of the illegalities of that whole project, so many of the aspects that this project is a continuation of colonialism that has been perpetuated in different parts of the world, including in the Middle East. And therefore, for the first time, there is a public opinion in the world that believing in a completely different discourse, that it is actually Zionist, colonial, settlers state, rather than that it is a state that has almost like a natural state that has a right to exist and defend itself. So that discourse itself play a role. That is the whole project of Said, is actually showing how Orientalism as a discourse played a role in the hegemony of the whole colonial world. That without that discourse, is a concept of hegemony of Gramsci is actually to be controlled without the use of coercion and force, because the discourse itself does that. And here, For the first time, we see people going out in the streets all over the world, from Japan all the way to America, even calling for the right of Palestinian or free Palestine as a different discourse altogether.
Yes,
Is it clear now?
you raise a big question, really, of how one changes the discourse in society. And there's no doubt that I think certainly in the West there is a great support for Israel, and for instance, you still have this belief that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and therefore it needs to be protected at all costs. And one needs to change attitudes of that kind. And I think that until these attitudes are changed, one's not going to get governments to act. And that is where one comes back to the role of civil society and to influence the discourse within civil society itself. But it is a major problem.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the presentation. I would like to ask a question regarding the case, the South African case, in the ICJ. And as I looked through the countries that support the case, we've seen countries like Egypt and countries like Jordan. And I will have to revert this back to the subject of Orientalism, and we see Trump coming in to meet with Arab leaders, and there's this kind of Arab custodianship over the case of Palestine. And I think this kind of needs to be broken, because some of that Arab custodianship is not fair to the Palestinian voices. And I am glad there have been voices coming from Latin America, from South Africa, to support the case of Palestine, because it's truly an international issue. Countries like Egypt and Jordan are politically implicated with support to Israel in some ways, through trade routes, through some unfair political discussions. And we see them being mediators. They're not fair guarantors of the peace process or the ceasefire, which broke, by the way, the ceasefire broke. So in that case, do you see the inclusion of Arab countries to the ICJ case in a way, basically a way to wash their hands from affiliations and discussions with the Israeli side? And how do you see the law having international parties suing Israel as a way to break this Arab exclusive custodianship over the Palestinian case? Thank you.
My hearing is very bad. What is it? Yes. Thank you. Well, you asked the question whether the fact that Arab states have joined in the proceedings before the International Court of Justice has harmed the situation. In fact, very few Arab states have intervened in the case that South Africa has brought against Israel. I think at present there are 13 states that have intervened in support of South Africa, but Palestine is one state. Very few, I can't think of it, other Arab states that have in fact intervened. So it's not true that Arab states have really joined South Africa before the International Court of Justice. Sorry, my hearing is bad. Let me put on my hearing aid, see if I can hear more clearly.
I have a loud voice. I think I think you're going to be fine with me. Hi, Professor. First of all, I'm very excited that you're here. When I first heard that you were here, I jumped up and down like a crazy person. I actually watched the ICJ hearing live, and before that I watched Norman Finkelstein talk about if Jean Dugard is there, then we're winning the ICJ case. So to have you in my city is a great honor and a wonderful surprise. And I guess my question is kind of similar to the gentleman's, which is that, you know, as an Arab person, we're told that our allyship for the cause is bound to be limited because we're essentially neighbors with a lunatic state that will just, you know, take any excuse to basically bomb us. So I have a lot of trouble actually expressing my support or actually doing anything of substantial effect for Palestine. So I'm wondering if you've encountered that in your early career. What do you do when you're told, no, it's too dangerous. It's too dangerous for you to support this. It's too dangerous to be in the international law space even. And yeah, basically, how did you combat that? And what motivates you to keep going when you know it's personally dangerous?
Well, this is a very difficult question. It depends upon how far you are prepared to take action yourself in order to right a wrong. And I found that as a lawyer, one could always invoke the law in order to achieve some measure of justice. Probably it's easier for lawyers to take action than other persons, but it does demand courage that people who stand up against the injustices taking place in Palestine are bound to face criticism. I think it's the criticism that many face is ostracism, that one is excluded from job opportunities and from employment. And I think that there are very serious consequences for showing one's courage in this respect. But nevertheless, there are always actions that are open to individuals within society to allow their voices to be heard in public demonstrations and in other respects. And so I don't think one should be too afraid of taking action. There's always some action that one can take within the law, and that I think is very important. There's a big distinction between acting within the law and outside the law, and I've always taken the view that one can achieve more by acting within the law than outside the law. I don't know whether that is helpful to you. This is what I found in South Africa. I had friends who acted outside the law and were either forced to flee the country or who were imprisoned. I think I achieved something by acting within the law, not perhaps as much as they achieved by their actions which resulted in loss of freedom for themselves. This is a difficult question, and I don't pretend to have an answer to it.
Hello, thank you so much, Professor Dugard, for this amazing speech and for honoring Edward Said's own history, memory on his 90th birthday. I work at a think tank based in Washington, D.C., and part of our work that we do is calling and litigating on the United States to utilize its own Leahy law, started by the late Senator Patrick Leahy, that prohibits the United States from providing assistance to military units that it knows is participating in war crimes, similar to most, like 95% of the current IDF units. And you've spoken about the upholding of international law. So my question is, how can small institutions and occupied peoples enforce or use international law and leverage it when international law is an agency of its own institutions and countries that only use it to its own benefit? These countries, similar to the UK and the US, they don't only fail to uphold international law, they fail to uphold their own national laws, their own war crimes acts that dates back to the 1990s. They fail to uphold their own laws that prohibit them from being complicit in war crimes. One example that comes to my mind is a couple of months ago, we've seen Armenia join the Mexican-French initiative that curbs the Security Council veto power in terms of mass atrocities. Do you think something similar could be done to enlarge the scope of international law, or is international law just a scam? Thank you so much.
Yes. Essentially, you asked a question about the role of international law in trying to achieve justice in international society. I must confess that I'm fairly despondent about international law myself. We've seen the failure of the United Nations to act well, United Nations Secretary General and its institutions are committed to international law, but because of the veto power of the United States, the United Nations is unable to act. So international law has not been effective at that level. And I think at other levels too, states have failed to employ international law. And so it is a bad time for international law and for international lawyers that the weaknesses of international law have become very apparent. And I do think that the situation in Palestine is really a litmus test for international law, for the survival of international law. And this is what troubles me with the behavior of Western states. They have failed to enforce elementary principles of international law, such as the right to self-determination of the Palestinian people, the prohibition on genocide, violation of norms of human rights. And I do think that this has serious consequences for international law itself. So I do think that international law has a role to play, but I can understand your concerns about whether international law is fulfilling its purpose. And I too have doubts myself.
Thank you, John, for your very interesting lecture. You mentioned in this lecture that in the case of South Africa, the United Nations took a strong stand against South Africa, whereas in the case of Israel and Gaza, the United Nations did not do much because of, I think, the reluctance of the great powers, especially the United States, to take action. So this leads us to say the problem now lies with the United Nations, and we both worked for the United Nations. We know what it can do when it cannot do. Do you think we need a reform of the United Nations? And if yes, how can this be done? Because it is still now controlled by the big powers, and the rest, the majority, even in the General Assembly, is not able to adopt this reform. And this raises another question. In the case the United Nations is unable to take action, can the developing countries, or the global south as we call it, come together and take action against Israel, like breaking relations, suspending its membership in international organizations, setting up some international tribunals like it did in the case, in other cases, in Yugoslavia and so on. So there are many other options. So what do you think can be done? Is it enough to complain, to criticize, or are there ways to take action and to try to bring a change? Thank you.
Well, so you will know that the question of the reform of the United Nations is a major issue, but I do think that the present conflict in Gaza has emphasized the need for reform of the United Nations. The United States has used its veto so frequently and in situations where it's very clear that the majority of states are strongly in favor of action, that it's become apparent that one needs to reform the United Nations to do away with the veto power of the permanent 5 members. But that's a big question, and it's very difficult to see how this can be done, given the fact that any reform to the United Nations system will require the agreement of the major powers. So that's the obvious answer to that question, and you know that problem. But the other question, and this is one that interests me, is that in the case of South Africa, sanctions started at what one might describe at grassroots level, with the smaller states, African states in particular, imposing sanctions on South Africa, economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions. And ultimately, these sanctions spread under the influence of civil society in Western states. That in the United States, for instance, great pressure was brought upon pension funds to disinvest from South Africa, and that had a major impact on the attitude of governments towards South Africa. So I do think that civil society has an important role to play in taking action. One might raise the question, too, whether the General Assembly could do more. Take, for instance, the question of an arms embargo. It's very clear that there is no support in the Security Council for a mandatory arms embargo on South Africa. But I do think that the General Assembly, which has now started to use this power to promote an arms embargo, should become more active in imposing sanctions of this kind, as an arms embargo, and calls for cultural, sporting, academic boycotts. In the case of South Africa, for instance, a sporting boycott had tremendous effect, and cultural boycotts. But in the case of Israel, one sees, for instance, there's a great debate about whether Israel should be excluded from Eurovision, which I would have thought would be an obvious action for civil society to take, and also for exclusion from FIFA and from football bodies. And so there is much that can be done by civil society at that level. So I don't think one should be too despondent about what action one can take. But when it comes to the reform of the United Nations, I really don't know how that's going to be achieved.
I think we can have a lot of questions. Can you have the mic already? The mic. Yes, sure. There, one there, and that's it. And then we'll give room for a question by... No, your question is important.
All right. Thank you very much. I have two questions, if you'd allow me. Like, firstly, building on the thread on the positionality of international law, but more on the nature of international law itself, and to what extent, if any, do you see that the legal proceedings against Israel is sort of resembling a case of fighting the system from within? Like, to what extent does the international legal system is systemically resistant to such proceedings, or attributed to, the context of its creation, or has remnants of a Western bias or an imperialist bias? And if you'd allow me, on a more personal level, how do you yourself, as a legal practitioner and scholar, how would you operationalize your own reflexivity and your own moral imperative against a system that is typically immoral? So that's my first question. My second question is, you've spoken briefly and comparatively between the both apartheid states of Israel and South Africa, and also on the international responses, but if you could draw some lines of similarity or dissimilarity on the local response and the local resistance between both apartheid states, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Second question.
It's a really complicated question. I think it has to do about is there a comparison with the legal system and local systems of domination like South Africa, Israel, separate system? And then how do we operationalize on the global level your resistance to apartheid so that it becomes something that
Big question. I guess so many big questions tonight. Essentially, the question is, how does one change the system? That's essentially what you are asking, aren't you? My own view is that international law does provide a framework for change. And one saw that in the case of apartheid South Africa. I always took the view as a lawyer in South Africa that ultimately international law would prevail, and took a long time. But at the end of the day, international law did play a major role in the termination of apartheid, that economic sanctions through the United Nations did have a major effect. There were other factors as well, but at the end of the day, international law did play an important role in bringing apartheid to an end. And what I find so depressing in the case of Palestine is that international law is completely abandoned. Israel has in effect been exempted from compliance with international law. That Western powers do not approach the question of Palestine in terms of international law. You have decisions of the United Nations, of the International Court of Justice, laying down the rules that should be applied, but states simply refuse to comply with them. And that is what I find so depressing. And so the question is, how do you persuade states to comply with international law? And this comes back to the role of civil society within states. Pressure has to be brought to bear upon governments to change their attitude towards compliance with international law. Not an answer, but an observation.
We have one last question from the audience, and then...
Yeah, I guess to finish things off then, do you still see any value in the Genocide Convention, considering the fact that it's an article is written about whether there is even a point of a Genocide Convention if no one is finding genocide in the case of Palestine against Israel, or in the Israeli genocide of Palestine? Do you see much sense in the convention remaining, since it's very much tied to the Holocaust? And do you see that the Crimes Against Humanity Convention, which is slowly gaining traction and will be passed soon and maybe even ratified, do you see that there's more value in the Crimes Against Humanity Convention for the future than the Genocide Convention? Sorry, you look confused.
Yes. Yes, as I mentioned in my lecture, I think there is resistance to the use of the term genocide, particularly in the case of Israel. The Genocide Convention is the most serious, dramatic international convention, and so there is a tendency on the part of many states to prefer to judge a situation in terms of war crimes or crimes against humanity, whereas genocide is the most serious crime of all, and states are reluctant to accept that genocide is being committed, particularly in the case of Israel. And I think one has to bear in mind that, as I mentioned in my lecture, there is still a belief in the West in particular that Israel is not capable of committing the crime of genocide, that the crime of genocide was initiated in order to protect Israel, and so Israel is to some extent exempt from genocide. And I think that still characterizes the response of many people in the West. But I do believe that the time has come for us to judge situations in terms of genocide. Not only in the case of Israel, I think one, of course, in Sudan we have the same situation, but it's more difficult to characterize the civil war in Sudan within the limits of the Genocide Convention, whereas in the case of Israel-Palestine, it is easy to judge it in terms of the norms of the Genocide Convention.
Okay, One last question from Hani, say.
So it's me now asking you a question. It's a question about, from a lawyer to a lawyer, about legal tactics. So you mentioned that proving the intent is one of the most difficult dimensions of making the genocide case before the ICJ. And I think one difficulty is because the limiting of the temporal scope to what happened in Gaza since 2023, Israel will always have the counter-argument that our intent is self-defense, not... And so would that actually, would it have been tactically better to not focus only on Gaza, but to actually include the systematic policies of the Israeli government since 1948 onward in the way they treated Palestine, especially that Limkin, when he described genocide, he described the killing as only one dimension of, cultural, economic, et cetera. The second tactical question is, what do we do if the ICJ came out and said there is no genocide in Palestine? How are we going to deal with the negative consequences of that?
Well, I think you raised the question of the role of self-defense, which is important. Israel's immediate response to the case that South Africa brought was that Israel was acting in self-defense. And it's quite clear that in terms of the Genocide Convention, the courts has made this very clear, that the physical destruction of a group must be the only inference that can be drawn from the situation. And Israel argued initially, at any rate, that it was acting in self-defense. But of course, it has become more difficult as Israel has responded to ceasefires. So when you have a ceasefire in effect, and there is a state of peace, as it were, and Israel violates the ceasefire and takes action against Palestine, it's very difficult for it to argue self-defense in those situations. So this is the big question of how one proves that the destruction of the group, the physical destruction of the group, is the only inference that one can draw from its behavior. And I think that in the case of Israel, one can do this by looking at the facts of the situation and at the declarations of genocidal intent by so many Israeli leaders, which is really quite extraordinary.
Thank you.
I think we have to go. We have to stop. Okay, one short question. Go ahead. Mike.
Thank you, that was very good.
Thank you. This evening would have not been given justice without first thanking you for being here, because I witnessed apartheid South Africa.
Yes.
I was there. I witnessed de Klerk twice in meetings when he advocated the removal of apartheid. I've been there when black has to go somewhere and white has to go somewhere, so I am part of that. This night would not be fair without thanking you and de Klerk for being the conscience that brought change to South Africa. Because without your conscience and de Klerk, as I talk to you now, my memory goes back to de Klerk. He was on the front table, delivering a speech, and I was in the back room, listening to the clerk. It wasn't international law that changed apartheid. It was the people like you, like the clerk, who changed South Africa. The question is, are the Israelis so inhuman they don't have conscience like South Africa? This is the question that I raise to you. Is there a chance that Israel somehow can produce the conscience of the clerk, the conscience of you, the conscience at that time, who was my personal friend, the former Minister of Finance under President Mbeki? I sat down with Mbeki about 3 times, 2 or 3 times. I remember very well the glass of wine which he gave me at that time. So the question is, why? There is no conscience amongst the Israelis or the Zionists. I'm not saying the Jews, I'm saying the Zionists, with their immense $1 trillion armada. Why can't they have the conscience which South Africa produced?
Well, I don't think that requires any answer to just thank you for your comments. I don't know to what extent I played a role in the change, but I think it is quite clear that the people of South Africa were largely responsible for the change that came about. And it was, to our surprise, a peaceful transformation, which I had never expected. I always expected that there would be a civil war in South Africa, which would bring apartheid to an end. And I was surprised and delighted when this didn't happen. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the people of South Africa prevailed. But I do think that one cannot ignore the fact that the international community did play a role in bringing about change in South Africa, that it did make it very clear that South Africa was out of step with the expectations of the international community, and it was in violation of international law at the same time. And so I do think that norms of this kind did play a role in the final abandonment of apartheid.
Thank you very much.